If you love our podcast, then I suspect you will be super pleased to join us live. That's right, it's time for our annual No Small Endeavor live Thanksgiving show. This year we'll be joined by New York Times bestselling author David Brooks with special guests Amy Grant and Sheryl Crow. It's a night of thoughtful conversation, moving music, and a room full of folks all in pursuit of no small endeavor. This year it's at the beautiful Schermerhorn Symphony Center here in Nashville, Tennessee. Mark your calendars for November 24. You will not want to miss this amazing night with some of our all-time favorite guests on the show. Don't wait. Go get your tickets now at nosmallendeavor.com. No Small Endeavor is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Whether you love true crime or comedy, celebrity interviews or news, you call the shots on what's in your podcast queue. And guess what? Now you can call them on your auto insurance too with the Name Your Price tool from Progressive. It works just the way it sounds. You tell Progressive how much you want to pay for car insurance, and they'll show you coverage options that fit your budget. Get your quote today at Progressive.com to join the over 28 million drivers who trust Progressive. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Price and coverage match limited by state law. I'm Lee C. Camp, and this is No Small Endeavor, exploring what it means to live a good life.
In 2015, Donald Trump comes down the escalator, and everything changed.
That's David French, New York Times opinion columnist.
We realized that the things that we thought were central and the things we thought were peripheral actually were reversed.
And that's editor-in-chief of Christianity Today, Russell Moore. Together, along with Curtis Chang, David and Russell co-founded a project called the Afterparty, seeking to redefine the frame of Christian engagement in American politics.
Scripture has a lot more to say about how we're to interact with our neighbor than it has to say about any specific policy outcome. We have over-instructed on issues, and we have under-instructed on character and on love.
All coming right up.
Support for this show comes from the Rabbis Go South podcast. Imagine 16 American rabbis jailed for acting on their beliefs. The Rabbis Go South is a thrilling 7-part narrative podcast that brings to life the real story of Jewish-Black solidarity in St. Augustine, Florida during the Civil Rights Movement. Discover what happened when the rabbis answered MLK's call. Presented by the Hub and Spoke Expo. Find The Rabbis Go South on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts.
I'm Lee C. Camp, and this is No Small Endeavor, exploring what it means to live a good life. In a recent interview with the theologian Stanley Hauerwas, whom Time magazine once called America's greatest theologian, I asked him whether he thought so-called religion was especially prone to lead its practitioners to self-deception. Stanley replied,
I think I'm going to avoid the word being religious. I think being a Christian can be a very dangerous business because it's an invitation to self-righteousness that can be extremely destructive, both for the person that's self-righteous and for those that they come in contact with.
This is not an outsider critique. Stanley himself professes his own Christian faith and practice, but forthrightly acknowledges the damage it may precipitate. I will not armchair psychologize myself, or at least I won't do so here in front of you, but I do confess a certain deep admiration for those who identify as practitioners of a given tradition and take that tradition so seriously that they find themselves compelled to critique that same tradition, even to do so on occasion in harsh and provocative ways. It's akin perhaps in a more gentle way to Abraham Lincoln's call to our better angels, or akin in a more harsh way to the 8th century BC Hebrew prophets who took the kindness of God so seriously that they denounced their fellows for their failures to practice justice or mercy or gratitude. In their own and quite different ways, my two guests today, like Stanley Hauerwas, are also high-profile Christians in public who have had a great deal to say critically about Christianity and politics. David French is an opinion writer for the New York Times, and Russell Moore is the editor-in-chief for Christianity Today. Both David and Russell identify as conservative and as Christian. In their own ways, they both have decried the damage and destruction enacted or facilitated by significant portions of the Christian church in America, and since 2015, their opposition to Donald Trump has precipitated vitriolic backlash and led them into fraught terrain. Today, we discuss their take on the current landscape of Christianity and politics and their own work to reframe the conversations and debates. Welcome. Glad to have both of you guys here with us today. For those who may not know kind of some of your story, how would you narrate challenges and change that you've weathered over the last decade, let's say? Russell, you want to give that a shot?
Well, I think that part of it is the kind of shaking of everything that has happened in American life. So I think over the last 10 years, there are a lot of people who thought, okay, we're all together, we're doing the right thing. Here's this category in my tribe, and there's that group over there, and that's their tribe. And all of that has been remixed in a lot of ways. So the things that we thought would divide those categories aren't actually what are the divisions now. And so I'm somebody who grew up and lived in a denominational context, Southern Baptist context, very, very deeply embedded in that, and am no longer still an evangelical Christian, committed Christian, but not in my denominational home context. And a lot of issues that seem to be separate, but actually I think are related. So the politicization that's happening within the church right now and with other sectors of American life, racial justice questions, and sexual abuse questions. Those things, I think, are actually coming from much of the same source, and that has divided up a lot of the traditional alliances.
Can you give just a glimpse to folks of what this has kind of meant for you personally?
Well, it meant a kind of exile from, I really haven't changed in terms of my basic framework of what I think at all, but a lot of the people that I worked with and served with have changed, and now I'm a liberal in their minds, even though I hold the same views that I always did.
Yeah. David, how would you summarize kind of the last categories of the last decade?
You know, Russell and I have lived parallel lives to an extent in different denominations. And so I was 10 years ago in the PCA and felt like it fit me like a glove, to be frank. So I'm conservative politically, I'm conservative theologically, conservative culturally. I was what you might call a full spectrum conservative. And also I was a Republican. In 2012, I was a Romney delegate to the Republican National Convention. Gosh, I was Republican going all the way back to the Reagan days when I came of age as a Reagan conservative. And so I felt very much at home. And then in 2015, Donald Trump comes down the escalator and everything changed. And no one was more surprised by this than me. And I feel like ever since I've been thinking, what did I miss? I've been examining myself. What was I blind to? Was I the fish that didn't know it was wet and sort of swimming in a culture that was different than what I thought it was? But what I would say is very similar to Russell is I didn't change in my theology. I didn't change in my political point of view. I remained a committed civil libertarian dedicated to free speech. I remained a pro-life advocate. And also, very critically, this is something that never caused a problem in GOP circles before. I remained an advocate for the importance of character in public officials. Because to me, my political conservatism really had two components to it. It had an ideological component and a characterological component, so to speak. That in essence, the United States, what's best for this country are people who are men and women of integrity, applying a particular ideology that I believed best reflects and would best lead to justice and human flourishing in the United States. But the integrity component was not optional. It was not optional. And so I will never forget, sort of sounding the alarm in late 2015, early 2016, appealing to documents and principles that had been clearly and unequivocally articulated during the Clinton era, and thinking I was going to get some sort of positive reception to it, and absolutely the opposite, just absolutely the opposite. And then it's only gotten worse since. And what I would also say is that if you maintain a more civil libertarian approach to the First Amendment, to religious free exercise, et cetera, you're going to be increasingly distant from the contemporary Republican Party. If you retain, say, a Reagan conservative view, sort of the power of our alliances and the importance of NATO and resisting Russian aggression, you're going to be more distant from the Republican Party. And both sides then look at each other and say, what happened to you?
Yeah. This is one quick follow-up. If you had to give like a 2 to 3 sentence, what is all of this that we find ourselves in the midst of boiled down to in 2 to 3 minutes?
Well, I think you had groups of people who were doing the same thing, but now it's revealed were coming from completely different motivations. And as one commentator put it, we realized that the things that we thought were central and the things we thought were peripheral actually were reversed in some of those alliances. And I know a lot of the things that I would have argued, well, that's a caricature. So, for instance, I would spend a lot of my time saying, those of you who say that churches who want to have more traditional gender roles are misogynistic, that's just a complete caricature. It's not the case. Now I look and say, oh, there's a significant portion of people who actually were motivated by very hostile misogyny toward women. We've seen that in sexual abuse crisis and in other places. So I think there's been kind of an apocalypse and unveiling of that in many ways. And I think you also have with the breakdown of the institutions. So you can see this in the Republican Party. You can see it in a lot of the Christian denominations. The breakdown of the institutions has led to a kind of mob rule that's been fueled by social media. And so there's this illusion that, for instance, someone asked me the other day about Donald Trump reaching out to evangelical leaders. And I say, it doesn't have to, because the myth is that you reach the evangelical leaders and the evangelical leaders reach their constituencies. That is how it used to work. Donald Trump can go right around the leaders and mobilize his base, and the evangelical leaders are afraid of the followers, so they will adjust accordingly. That's happened in almost every institution.
That's fascinating. Now, Russell got more than 2 or 3 sentences.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
But if
I'm
you're,
grateful. That gave me time. It gave me some time to think about this. So I'm going to go with, if I'm going to go with 2 or 3 sentences, I'm going to go back to the Yeats poem, Second Coming. Mm-hmm. The worst are full of passionate intensity and the best lack all conviction. This is what is happening all over the place. And this goes to the institutional point that Russell was talking about. In many cases, because the best lack all conviction and the worst are full of passionate intensity, who wins these internal conflicts? The worst, those who are full of passionate intensity. And what we're beginning to see is really a part of a movement is motivated by true hatred. I mean, I'm talking when it comes to things like the misogyny that Russell was talking about. We have seen in my former denomination, the PCA, there are a remnant of Kenists and outright sort of white nationalists that are along the fringes. We've seen that some in the Southern Baptist Convention. We have seen that there is an element that is motivated by what you would call sort of true hatred and bigotry, but there's a larger element that's really motivated by fear. And so what ends up happening is because that larger element is motivated by fear, they have this overwhelming fear of the left. They're incredibly vulnerable to the voices, the most strident voices. And they're also incredibly reluctant to do anything about those strident voices because they don't want to weaken the coalition. They don't want to weaken themselves in the face of a hostile world. And so there's the circle the wagons mentality. You know, there's this concept you've heard sometimes online, no enemies to the right, that it's fatally weakening us. It's weakening us if we do anything about some of these really vengeful and malicious forces. And so that's how you get into a place where, in many ways, almost the worst elements become the dominant voice. And the larger group of people who, in many ways, don't like that. They don't like the rhetoric. They don't like the ideas, but they have a greater concern for the left. And so they will not do one thing to sort of eliminate that, to ameliorate the harm or to prevent the harm caused by those voices. And it acts like a one-way ratchet. It's just towards extremism and towards extremism.
The only thing I would add to that is I think it's a fear not only of the left, but it is a fear of the far right as well.
For sure.
And specifically, the fear is of being called the left.
Yes.
And so the message is you're not really one of us if you are critiquing something that we're doing. And so there's this psychological sense of, okay, well, let's give people what they want a little bit, and then they'll settle down and get on board, and we can go back to doing what we were called to do.
Right.
And that just isn't happening.
What you guys are pointing to there is a fundamental question about whether or not we have sufficient character formation to be able to have conviction, right? And to act out of conviction and to call things that formerly we would have called fundamentally unjust or fundamentally unfair or fundamentally social exercises of hatred, what they are, right? So what hope do you have in the kind of consumerist world that we're in of there being sufficient forces, possibilities for the kind of character formation that we need today?
Let me preface this by contrasting my Twitter feed and my inbox. Okay. So the Twitter feed, Twitter and social media world, it's full of the people who are sort of who are the most committed, most activist subset of Americans. And they are highly aggressive. They are highly polarized. They are immovable and often quite malicious. You could go into Twitter and look at the responses to Russell, look at the responses to me. If that's your snapshot, you would think that the church is full of militantly, potentially even flirting with violence, militant Christians who are essentially wanting to launch sort of a new crusade to transform America from the ground up as a Christian nation, often tinged with white nationalism. And you would think that, wow, this is a dominant strand of Christianity. Then you look at the inbox, people who are not wanting to weigh into that cesspool, more normal, average, everyday people who are absolutely in despair. They don't know what to do. They don't know how things got out of control. They're asking the very questions that you're asking. But the reason why it's in the inbox and not on Twitter is they don't want to be swarmed. They don't want to be attacked. Even raising questions can create an atmosphere of bullying and intimidation. And so the reality is there's so many people who are deeply discontent with the present state of affairs, but they have been bullied, been intimidated. We know about this because we know of this whole concept of the exhausted majority, and they're just shrinking back. But what gives me hope is they might be exhausted, but they're still a majority. They're still a majority. That means there's an enormous amount of latent cultural and political power that can do something about this. But we have to move it from passive to active.
You're listening to No Small Endeavor and our conversation with Russell Moore and David French. I love hearing from you. Tell us what you're reading, who you're paying attention to, or send us feedback about today's episode. You can reach me at lee@nosmallendeavor.com. You can get show notes for this episode in your podcast app or wherever you listen. These notes include links to resources mentioned in the episode, as well as a PDF of my complete interview notes and a full transcript. We would be most appreciative if you'd go to your favorite podcast app and there write up a glowing 5-star review of No Small Endeavor. Those reviews help extend the reach of the beauty, truth, and goodness we are seeking to sow in the world, and we would be, as I said, most appreciative. Coming up, Russell and David's initiative called the Afterparty, moving political focus back to character rather than a narrow set of issues, and the cost of apathy in a political environment defined by extremes. As a listener of No Small Endeavor, you might be concerned about the intangible things that help us live a good life. We explore this on our show, but we haven't yet explored how our niche interests can help us accomplish this. Like, for example, my decade-long niche interest in flying sailplanes, gliders. Good thing there's an entire podcast devoted to this effort to glean meaning from little-known niche interests and help us understand why they matter, all while being sincerely curious and hopeful. It's called Niche to Meet You, and it was recently picked by Apple Podcast for their new and noteworthy editorial list. The show reminds me of my recent conversation with David Brooks, in which he says, the way you pay attention to people becomes the way you live in the world. We welcome you to listen to the Niche to Meet You podcast, and when you leave a review, tell them No Small Endeavor sent you. Enjoy. So recently, both of you two, along with Curtis Chang, have developed the Afterparty. So for those who are unaware, what's the Afterparty about, and what are you trying to do with that?
It's a curriculum for Christian political engagement, but it's different from, I think, any other curriculum that I've seen. I'm no stranger to these kinds of curricula. I mean, I grew up in the 80s in the era of worldview training, where you would go somewhere for some time and you'd learn how to be a good Christian anti-communist, for example. And all of the training, all of these curricula that I have seen, I'm not saying all of them, but all that I have seen, and certainly the ones that gained a lot of currency, were all issue-oriented. So this is what Christians should believe about abortion. This is what Christians should believe about religious liberty, about economics, about foreign policy. And so what it did, though, is it created a mindset and a view amongst many Christians that politics is about outcomes. That's what politics is about, period. And what we have done with the Afterparty is reset the frame. Because if you look at Scripture has a lot more to say about how we're to interact with our neighbor, how we're to interact with the world, than it has to say about any specific policy outcome. And in fact, for even being defined in front of the world, what is the fruit of the Spirit? It isn't complementarianism, conservatism, and republicanism. That's not the fruit of the Spirit. It's kindness, peace, patience, gentleness, self-control, and all of these other virtues. And so what we're trying to say is, wait, let's pause for a minute. We have over-instructed on issues, and we have under-instructed on character and on love. And so what we're doing is it's refocusing on loving your neighbor, on how we treat our neighbor, how we interact in the public square.
You have to have groups within churches that are starting to say, wait, this isn't the way we want to be. This isn't the way we want to go. We want something different, and we want to explore together how to get there. That's what this does, which is to say, let's reset our priorities. What's the ultimate goal?
I've gone through the whole curriculum, and surprisingly, I would imagine to a lot of folks, in addition to what you just said, is you focus a lot on hope and humility and the way those two practices kind of correlate or not to a certain kind of vision. You're pretty confessional yourselves about, this is kind of where I fall on that hope-humility quadrant. At my best, I look like this. At my worst, I look like this. And I think that kind of willingness to invite people to first ask about ourselves rather than first asking about the other is itself a really helpful, instructive, exemplary approach.
One of the things we did not want to do is present ourselves as some sort of like Platonic form of cultural engagement. Like that's not,
No.
I have made mistakes. And it's interesting, we've all made mistakes. All of us behind the curriculum, we've all made mistakes, and they were different based on sort of our disposition and our personality. I'm a former litigator. I have always been pretty combative. Now, I've always tried to advance my ideas in a way that's civil and respects the humanity and dignity of my political and legal opponents. But that's been my temptation, is to be the more combative person. And sometimes it doesn't go well. Sometimes that's not the right approach. And in our current political environment, we have a giant amount of people going for justice with their fists raised, right? And very little kindness and almost no humility. And each one of those obligations exists side by side. They're not optional. Mm-hmm. And so you cannot forsake kindness and humility for the sake of justice. You cannot forsake justice for the sake of kindness and humility. You have to harmonize these values. And right now, we are heavily weighted towards the issue advocacy, justice issues, and often believing that kindness and humility are a fool's game, a sucker's game. What? You're going to get beat. You're going to lose if you exhibit these kinds of values. And we're trying to confront that mindset.
Yeah. I assume, just for sake of clarification, when you say we have a lot of fists raised on behalf of justice and not a lot of humility and kindness, is that an apt description for you of what's happening on both the right and the left?
At the far edges, there's this theory called horseshoe theory, that as people get more extreme, they become more alike, not necessarily in their underlying political views. So you could have a far right person who's very pro-life and a far left person who's very pro-choice, But in the means of their engagement, they become very much alike. They become very punitive. They become very pugilistic. So we're identifying a phenomenon we see in individuals on both sides of the aisle, no question.
Yeah. I loved the story in the Afterparty about Nancy befriending a critic of yours.
Yeah.
Would you tell that story? Nancy French is a journalist and author, and Nancy is married to David.
That's a tremendous story. So Nancy, we've been walking through this challenge together, and we've responded in some interesting and different ways. And one of the things that Nancy did some time ago was after she had written in the Washington Post about being a victim of sex abuse as a 12-year-old at the hands of a Sunday school teacher, a vacation Bible school teacher. What was really discouraging to her was how many people in the church were angry at her for talking about that story. And she began to look for friends where she could find them. If somebody was kind to her online, she would respond to them. And one of the people who was kind to her and she responded to, when she kind of dug into this person's social media past and history, found out that this person hated me. I mean, hated me with a capital H, hated me. And mainly because I'm a longtime pro-life advocate and lawyer, and she was pro-choice, and very militantly so. But Nancy also saw, as she saw this just vitriol pouring out on me, that during the pandemic, the height of the early lockdowns and shutdowns, that this person named Kathy was having trouble getting food. And so Nancy reached out to her and said, how can I help? And in this discussion, found out that Kathy was disabled and shut in and unable to leave and shop. And all the grocery stores were swamped. They couldn't deliver to her. And so Nancy activated a group of people, including some dear friends of ours, to help get Kathy food. And during that process, which was ultimately wildly successful, Kathy got overwhelmed with food. They formed a friendship, a very genuine friendship. Now, it doesn't mean that Kathy is pro-life now. It doesn't mean that Nancy is pro-choice now, but they formed a very genuine and deep friendship. And guess what? So did Kathy and I, culminating in this just wonderful moment when Nancy was telling a story at the Lincoln Center in New York for a storytelling group called The Moth. Yeah. And she invited Kathy to come to the Lincoln Center to hear her. And I escorted Kathy arm in arm to her seat. And it was just a beautiful example, I think, of how when you put into practice the principles of the Afterparty, where you love your neighbor, even if you disagree with your neighbor, you love your neighbor, you can achieve an enormous amount of healing and reconciliation and create genuine friendships.
Yeah, it is a beautiful picture of possibilities that,
yes.
I hope that we can lean into. So with the Afterparty, you're focusing upon, these are ways we want to engage with one another politically while continuing to insist this doesn't mean that these various issues of justice are unimportant. We still must engage these. How do you envision moving from one to the other?
Now, it's really interesting the dynamic that I have seen is you will often see people who are issue people, and then you'll have people who are like pluralism people or democracy people or peacemaking people. And so essentially what they say, once you get into one category, like I'm the person who's trying to host the difficult conversations, I'm the person who's trying to bring people together, it becomes very difficult to also be an issue person, because as soon as you raise an issue, then you're being divisive. Right. So what we're trying to do is say, no, we have to do all of it. And we have to be able to be an issue person.
I often give the example of a conversation I saw happen one time in a church with two city council members in that community, one of whom came up and said, I'm really concerned about what the Bible teaches about widows and orphans. We have a lot of single women in our community who can't support their children, and I'm really working to raise the minimum wage here in order to address that. Another city council member say, I'm really concerned about the single mothers in our community and their children. I'm afraid if we move minimum wage up, that the businesses are going to cut hours, and that's going to sacrifice their health insurance. Those two people are both coming at this with a character that's formed in the right direction. The motivations are, now they can get together and argue out the prudential differences. That's very different from the hypothetical third person who might come in and say, these single women, they should be married, they're losers and takers, we shouldn't be concerned about it. that would be something that ought to be
Yeah.
corrected immediately and at the character level, not
Yeah.
just the issue level.
I mean, that does seem to me to be something that's so often overlooked, is that you can have people who have fundamentally different policy preferences, but really do want the same thing.
They want the same thing.
Yeah.
And if they actually, a lot of times, not all the time, but a lot of times, if they actually start wrestling through the issue together, rather than simply looking back to say, well, what is my tribe thinking about the fact that I'm talking to this person, they realize, oh, we actually do care about the same thing, and there might be a third way to get there.
Yeah. Over the last decade, with all the change and things that we've already kind of nodded to, question about just you personally. When you think about prudence or wisdom for navigating the challenges, the pressures that you have dealt with, what are some things that you've learned just how to be a human being who stays in pursuit of your sense of vocation, in pursuit of what you understand to be a good life, in a way that sticks with it, in a way that seems to lend itself toward flourishing of some sort?
I remember I had a friend years ago who was talking about his dad, who was a doctor. And he said, my dad was a very good man, but he never understood that he was not his gift. And so the minute that he stopped being a doctor, he said he died almost immediately because he couldn't think of himself outside of that category. Part of it is the constant reminder, not only I am not my gift set, but also I am not an extension of whatever tribe I believed myself to be part of. And also to what I've noticed in some of the tumult of the past several years is how I need people in unique ways. There's one friend of mine for whom what I need from him is gallows humor. And so he's the one who, when I went to his house in one of the darkest days of the Southern Baptist situation, he met me at the door and said, well, good news is you can have bourbon now. And we just stopped and laughed. And I realized I haven't laughed in a long time. And then there are other people you need other things from. So I think I think we should be grateful for that.
My wife and I made sort of a pact with each other when all of this journey, when we began to see what was coming, when we could see, it was, I'll be honest, initially a big shock to us to have so many members of our own church body actually very angry at us for not supporting Donald Trump. Now, in hindsight, in 2024, I say those words and someone would say, how naive, how naive. But in 2015, 2016, I had believed all of these words that had been spoken for so long about character and integrity and how bad adultery was and all of this. And sexual assault and sexual abuse were disqualifiers for high office. And I believed all those words. And so when you go and say, hey, look, this guy too, and all of a sudden, not only are people disagreeing with you, which, okay, disagreement is just part of life, but they're turning on you as if you're Benedict Arnold, as if you're not just wrong, you're a traitor.
And an apostate.
A heretic. I mean, just Google heretic and Russell Moore or heretic and David French. And so it was a shock to the system. It really was a shock. And so at that point in time, Nancy and I said, we're not going to end any relationships over politics, but if people end them with us, we can't help that. And Nancy had a great way of saying it. He said, at the end of this, we're going to still have friends. They might be different friends in some ways. And that has been true. I have had a core group of friends that have stuck with us through thick and thin. We've had some surprising people just absolutely reject us. And then I've been blessed to meet some new friends who are some of the greatest people I've ever known. And I'm grateful because, but for this political division, I would have never known, not only not have had the benefit of the friendship, but I would have not had the benefit of having my eyes opened to some of the just truly wonderful people who just a few short years ago, I would have said, oh, those are my political opponents. Those are over there, and I'm over here. But it's been a gift. It has been a blessing to get to know some of these wonderful folks.
Thank you. We're going to take a short break, but coming right up, why 2024 is not a repeat of 2016 or 2020, the cost of apathy, in a political climate defined by extremes, and how we might move forward with humility and gratitude. Hey there! Did you know that we have a newsletter? Just imagine if you could have one of your favorite ethics professors send you a list of things to reflect on, think about, practical actions with which to experiment, all on your way to sorting through what it might mean to live a good life. Well, that is the NSC Notebook. I riff on themes and topics related to the show and our guests. Sign up for my NSC Notebook today at nosmallendeavor.com/newsletter. The current election year, where we find ourselves right now in the midst of social, political context, what most immediately has your attention as far as particular happenings that are causing you concern?
Well, I think there are a lot of people who assume, especially in churches, who will say, I can't believe we're going through this again. I do not think that that is the case at all for a number of reasons. I mean, one of them being part of what was so traumatic about 2016 is what we talked about earlier, this sense of disorientation and betrayal. I can't believe that you would support him, or I can't believe you wouldn't support him. That kind of dynamic, which is no longer there. We're kind of numb to all of that in many cases. But the problem is, in fact, the numbness. There are things that are on the table right now that if either David or I or you had said in 2016, look, I'm concerned about the fact that you will one day wave away sexual assault or paying off porn stars in order to influence elections or inciting mobs on the United States Capitol in order to stop the certification of an election, we would have been seen as deranged.
Yeah.
Well, now we're at a point where all of that has become so normalized that when a jury finds the now Republican nominee guilty of sexual assault that the judge calls rape, it's not even on the front page of the newspapers because this sort of thing has just become so common to us. And I'm afraid that political violence has also become common to us. There's not a sense of shock about that anymore. And so I'm very, very worried about what could happen in a number of different scenarios in the fall.
You know, one of the things that I don't think enough people are aware of is the extent to which a culture of intimidation, bullying, harassment, and outright threat has become endemic, just endemic on the right, to such an extent that you can almost guarantee that if you've talked to a public figure of even people with relatively small public platforms, you can almost guarantee if you talk to a public figure who has opposed Donald Trump, that they will tell you stories of harassment, intimidation, attempts to destroy their career, threats against their lives, potentially threats against their family. This is not unusual at all. And what is so distressing to me, when people hear about this on the right, many of them, their initial reaction is not anger that this is occurring. It's anger that you're talking about it. Mm-hmm. And why is there anger that you're talking about it? Well, because it might cause people not to support Donald Trump. And they have to support Donald Trump because America may fall, America might die. And it's, yeah, sure, it's a shame that there's all these threats and everything out there, but the stakes are that high. And I would say the thing that has been most discouraging to me in the church's reaction to the moment has not been about the group of people who are the threateners and the intimidators and the harassers and all of that. It has not been that they exist. You know that those people exist in this world. A nation of 300 million people, you're going to have a lot of bad apples in that mix. The thing that has gotten me is that the incredible indifference to the point of enablement that you have seen from the institutional church, including the unbelievable apathy of people in the pews to what is being done in their name. And it's not just apathy, it's a sense of victimhood. You know, one of the things that people say, you know, folks in the pews have long said is, why doesn't the media like us? Why doesn't the media like us? Well, I'm in the media and I can start to see some insights about that. So for example, if almost all of your communications with rank and file Christians consists of name calling, insults, malice, sometimes threats, And then there's no pushback on that. No one's saying stop. No one's standing up to it. And if that's your experience, what are you going to think of that group of people? What are you? And it's going to be fair, by the way. It's going to be fair to think that a group of people that stands by while an angry and potentially violent fringe harasses, bullies, and tries character assassination. Why? Why? Because they think that I'm so dangerous, I'm going to destroy America. It is so incredibly dispiriting. It is so dispiriting. And it has really changed my view on this sort of idea that you say, well, there's just only a few people who are really bad. Everyone else is just great. Everyone. No, there's a lot of apathy. There's a lot of enabling that's going on here. And at the heart of it is a lot of fear and anger. And that's what's deeply discouraging.
And a lot of the threats, intimidation, and I mean serious threats and intimidation, doesn't just come to people like David and me who have been opposed to this political movement from the very beginning. It's with people who are in that movement, but who deviate on any one part of it. They are then receiving that, sometimes with even more force because they're traitors. That's not an American way of civic life, and it's certainly not a moral way of civic life.
Two final last quick questions. It's common in peace resolution work, conflict resolution work, to distinguish positions from interests. Mm-hmm. Someone might have a position one sees as fundamentally horrific, but have an interest underneath that one can see as legitimate.
Right.
So when you're looking at those who are supporting Trump, are there interests there that you see as legitimate that could help broaden a space for constructive dialogue?
Yeah. One of the issues that we have is it's a two-party system, and both parties are flawed. And so if you're in a position where, for example, Democratic policies have been particularly harmful to you or have failed in your community in a particular way, or if your family is more squeezed by inflation, for example, and you're frustrated by inflation, our system is designed that there's one recourse here. It is vote for that opposing party. And so I think if you browbeat Republicans into sort of saying, it's not just that you need to support Donald Trump, it's that you also need to migrate on issue A, B, C, D, E, and F into some other camp. And because this Trumpism has to be just crushed completely, and then in that migration, you end up empowering a lot of policies you don't like. I wish people would understand that puts folks in a difficult position. It is a big ask to ask them to vote for the very politician that they think, whose policies they think are misguided because of the threat to democracy and everything from Trump, especially if they're not aware of all that's gone on. And this is something that I get to all the time with my friends in Blue America. You have no idea of the different knowledge set that exists in parts of Red America. The polls are astounding at the low level of knowledge of Trump's scandals amongst Republican Americans. So on the one hand, you have every Democratic scandal is hyped. It's horrible. It's terrible. It's going to destroy America. Every Trump scandal is either minimized or rationalized or ignored entirely. And so you have these people with these two different information sets. So I have enormous sympathy for folks in that circumstance. Where my sympathy runs out is in the chattering classes. These are the people who know good and well what Trump does. They know good and well who Trump is. And then they start browbeating followers of Jesus into supporting Donald Trump. So I have a huge amount of compassion for, say, the older woman at my church who came up to me one day and said, "David, why don't you support Donald Trump?" And I responded very, gently, "I just wish he lied less." And with dripping sincerity says, "He lies?" Just didn't cross her mind. And I think we have to realize that not everyone is going in here with eyes wide open, knowing everything that Trump has done and saying, support him anyway.
That's true. And I think a lot of people are still operating under the old political binaries that don't exist right now.
Yeah.
And so right now, what you have is not the question of right versus left as much as you do the question of democracy versus authoritarianism.
Yep.
And when that's the case, David and I both have said similar things to people who are trying to bring together a pro-democracy movement of right, center, and left and say, look, if you actually want conservatives and evangelicals who care about democracy and who care about norms, you can't ask them to declare their pronouns when they walk in the room. You have to understand we do have these differences, and we are going to continue to have these differences. And what we're not doing is saying, let's not argue about these things, saying, let's get through this crisis so that we can argue about these things under democratic, small d, democratic, small r, Republican norms.
Yeah. So last question, what kind of concrete, practical advice would you give to people who don't have a platform, may not even be deeply engaged in knowing what all's going on? What would you say you would wish more people in that majority you talked about early, David, would do?
That's a very good question. I actually had a real heart-to-heart about this with some friends of mine recently because after I got canceled from being a panelist at the Presbyterian Church in America's General Assembly, just amidst an avalanche of lies, malicious attacks, et cetera, and the denomination just caved almost instantaneously. And so I was talking to some good friends of mine, and I said, look, no one of us can fix our country ourselves. But all of us are in institutions. All of us belong to a local church. I'm talking to Christians here. We all belong to a local church. We all are part of different Christian institutions. And we can take responsibility for the health of that institution that we're a part of. And so don't be the person who is standing aside silently while some people in your congregation are being bullied out the door.
Yeah.
Don't stand aside. Don't just let it happen and say, it's not my business that the pastor is under siege from a small, angry group of people who want him to start talking about the elections being stolen. Take responsibility. Don't do the Homer Simpson thing where the eyes wide, you back into the shrubbery, and you just forget about it. But also don't do too much of an ask. Don't sit there and say, well, now you have to totally become this kind of political activist that you've never been in your life before. I do think people need a heightened awareness of where we are and to vote accordingly. But at the same time, we need people to take responsibility for the institutions that they're a part of. Go back to that, the Second Coming poem. The best lack all conviction, the worst are full of passion and intensity. You need conviction. You need intensity to defend the integrity of these institutions.
And it's not just that they're silent when people are bullied. A lot of people actually then become angry at the one who is bullied.
Yes.
Why are you so controversial that they had to bully you?
Yeah.
I mean, that is a toxic dynamic if we saw it in a family. It's a toxic dynamic when we see it in a church or a denomination or in a country. And so sometimes when people say, well, what do I do? What they want is a checklist. Here are the ways you can do this, this, and this, and we have all of this fixed by November. That is not possible. It's not so much a way of doing as it is a way of being. You can say, I can't change the entire world. I can't change the entire country. I can't change my political party. I can't change my church. What I can do is change myself, and I can resist being absorbed into and to normalize things that just aren't right or normal.
I'll give you a good example. So Nancy did an investigation. I came alongside later, but she did heroic, award-winning journalistic work to expose just one of the most grotesque cover-ups of sex abuse in the church that I've ever heard of. And this was the Kanakuk camps. She uncovered decades of sex abuse at one of the most powerful and wealthy Christian camps in the country. And what was remarkable to me was outside of a community of survivors who were overwhelmingly grateful that their story was finally being told, a lot of people treated this revelation as an annoyance. Wait, does that mean I have to rethink where my kid goes to summer camp? I'm not going to do that. My kid likes that camp. And so what we have seen is there's an exposure of how little people are willing to sacrifice, to uphold some really cardinal values and cardinal virtues. Wait, you want me to mean what I say about political integrity? Well, that might mean that there's a presidential race lost. Can't have that. Those are some of the biggest stakes, but any given individual vote, you can't track to that. But think about the summer camp example. What are you really giving up if you say, you know what, I'm not going to send my kid to a summer camp until I can trust that they're not going to cover up sex abuse. And then they're not going to try to silence and intimidate victims. That's not a big ask, but apparently it is. Apparently it is. And so this is what I mean when I talk about taking responsibility for the institutions that you belong to. Instead of being instinctively defensive, be instinctively justice-minded and think about, wait, is this critique accurate? Is there an actual real problem here? And so that's what's discouraging is how little effort people are willing to undertake that would cause them any inconvenience or any sort of sense of adversity to uphold some of these really cardinal values and virtues that I thought the church had always stood for.
Been talking to David French, opinion columnist for the New York Times, Russell Moore, editor-in-chief, Christianity Today. Grateful for y'all's generosity with your time today and the work you're doing and the conversation today.
Thank you. Love no small endeavor.
Thank you.
So honored to be here.
Thank you.
And Lee, it's always great to see you. And I just think back to our days in Omega Nu.
Yeah. Great to see you both. Thank you. You've been listening to No Small Endeavor and our interview with Russell Moore and David French, two of America's best-known political and theological commentators, and recent hosts of The Afterparty, subtitled Toward Better Christian Politics. We gratefully acknowledge the support of Lilly Endowment Incorporated, a private philanthropic foundation supporting the causes of community development, education, and religion. Our thanks to all the stellar team that makes this show possible. Christy Bragg, Jacob Lewis, Sophie Byard, Tom Anderson, Kate Hayes, Mary Evelyn Brown, Carriot Harmon, Jason Sheasley, Audrey Griffith, and Tim Lauer. Thanks for listening, and let's keep exploring what it means to live a good life together. No Small Endeavor is a production of PRX, Tokens Media LLC, and
Great Feeling Studios.